Welcome to the 1,000 Nights and One Night. Now, when it was the 633rd night, she continued, It hath reached me, O auspicious king, that when the old nurse saw the head of the eunuchry and his assistants making for her, she was in exceeding fear, and cried, There is no majesty and there is no might save in Allah the glorious and the great. Verily we are gods, and unto him we shall return. Without recourse we be dead folk this time. When the head eunuch heard her speak thus, fear got hold of him and by reason of that which he knew of the princess's violence, and that her father was ruled by her, and he said to himself, Belike the king hath commanded the nurse to carry his daughter forth upon some occasion of hers, whereof she would have known none, and if I oppose her, she will be wroth with me, and will say, This eunuch fellow stopped me, that he might pry into my affairs. So she will do her best to kill me, and I have no call to meddle in this matter. So saying, he turned back with him and the 30 assistants, who drove the people from the door of the palace. Whereupon the nurse entered and saluted the eunuchs with her head, whilst all the 30 stood to do her honor, and returned her salam. She led in the prince, and he ceased not from following her from door to door, and the protector protected them, so that they passed all the guards till they came to the 7th door. It was that of the great pavilion wherein was the king's throne, and it communicated with the chambers of his women and the saloons of the harem, as well as with his daughter's pavilion. So the old woman halted and said, Here we are, O my son, and glory be to him who hath brought us thus far in safety. But, O my son, we cannot foregather with the princess except by night, for night enveileth the fearful. He replied, True, but what is to be done? Quoth she, Hide thee in this black hole, showing him behind the door a dark and deep cistern with a cover thereto. So he entered the cistern, and she went away and left him there till ended day, when she returned and carried him into the palace, till they came to the door of Hayat Al-Nufus' apartment. The old woman knocked, and a little maid came out and said, Who is at the door? Said the nurse, 'Tis I. Whereupon the maid returned and craved permission of her lady, who said, Open to her, and let her come in with any who may accompany her. So they entered, and the nurse, casting a glance around, perceived the princess had made ready the sitting chamber, and ranged the lamps and row and lighted candles in wax, and chandeliers of gold and silver, and spread the divans and estrades with carpets and cushions. Moreover, she had set on trays of food and fruits and confections, and she had perfumed the place with musk and aloes wood and ambergris. She was seated among the lamps and the tapers, and the light of her face outshone the luster of them all. When she saw the old woman, she said to her, O nurse, where is the beloved of my heart? And the others replied, O my lady, I cannot find him, nor have mine eyes espied him. But I have brought thee his own sister, and here she is. Cried the princess, Art thou gin mad? What need have I of his sister? Say me, and a man's head irk him, doth he bind up his hand? The old woman answers, No, by Allah, O my lady. But look on her, and if she pleases thee, let her be with thee. Then she uncovered the prince's face, whereat Hayat Al-Nufus knew him, and running to him, pressed him to her bosom, and he pressed her to his breast. Then they both fell down in a swoon, and lay without sense a long while. The old woman sprinkled rose water upon them till they came to themselves, when she kissed him on the mouth more than 1,000 times, and improvised these couplets. Sought me this heart's dear love at gloom of night. I rose and honored till I sat forthright, and said, O aim of mine, O sole desire, in such night visit hast of guards no fright? Replied he, Yes, I feared much, but love robbed me of all my wits and reft my sprite. We clipped with kisses, and a while clung we, for here 'twas safe for fear we watchmen white. Then rose we parting without doubtful deed, and shook our skirts where none a stain could sight. And Shahrazad perceived the dawn of the day, and ceased to say her permitted say. Now, when it was the 734th night, she pursued, It hath reached me, O auspicious king, that when her lover visited Hayat Al-Nufus in her palace, the twain embraced, and she improvised some happy couplets beseeming the occasion. And when she had ended her extempore lines, she said, Is it indeed true that I see thee in my abode, and that thou art my cupmate and my familiar? Then passion grew on her, and love was grievous to her, so that her reason well nigh fled for joy, and she improvised these couplets. With all my soul I'll ransom him who came to me in gloom of night, whilst I had waited long to see his figure loom, and naught aroused me save his weeping voice of tender tone, and whispered I, fair fall thy foot, and welcome and welcome. His cheek I kissed 1,000 times, and yet 1,000 times more, then clipped and clung about his breast, and veiled in darkling room, and cried, now verily, I've won the aim of every wish, so praise and prayers to Allah for his grace now best become. Then slept we even as we would the goodliest of nights, till morning came to end our night, and light up earth with bloom. As soon as it was day, she made him enter a place in her apartment unknown to anyone, and he abode there till nightfall, when she brought him out, and they sat in converse and carouse. Presently he said to her, I wish to return to mine own country, and tell my father what hath passed between us, that he may equip his wazir to demand thee in marriage of thy sire. She replied, O my love, I fear, an thou return to thy country and kingdom, thou wilt be distracted from me, and forget the love of me, or that thy father will not further thy wishes in this matter, and I shall die. Meseems the better rede were that thou abide with me, and in my hand clasp, I looking on thy face, and thou on mine, till I devise some plan, whereby we may escape together some night, and flee to thy country, for I have cut off my hopes from mine own people, and I despair of them. He rejoined, I hear and I obey. And they fell again to their carousal and conversing. He tarried with her thus for some time, till one night the wine was pleasant to them, and they lay not down, nor did they sleep till the break of day. Now it chanced that one of the kings sent her father a present, and amongst other things a necklace of union jewels, 29 grains, to whose price a king's treasure might not suffice. Quoth Abd al-Qadir, this revere beseemeth none but my daughter Hayat Al-Nufus. And turning to a eunuch whose jaw teeth the princess had knocked out for reasons best known to herself, he called to him and said, Carry the necklace to thy lady, and say to her, one of the kings hath sent her father this as a present, and its price may not be paid with money. Put it on thy neck. The slave took the necklace, saying in himself, Allah Almighty make it the last thing she shall put on in this world, for that she depraved me of the benefit of my grinder teeth. And repairing to the princess's apartment, found the door locked, and the old woman asleep before the threshold. He shook her, and she awoke in a fright, and asked, What dost thou want? To which he answered, The king hath sent me on an errand to his daughter. Quoth the nurse, The key is not here. Go away whilst I fetch it. But quoth he, I cannot go back to the king without having done his commandment. So she went away as if to fetch the key, but fear overtook her, and she sought safety in flight. Then the eunuch awaited her a while. Then finding she did not return, he feared that the king would be angry at his delay, so he rattled at the door and shook it, whereupon the bolt gave way and the leaf opened. He entered and passed on till he came to the 7th door, and walking into the princess's chamber, found the place splendidly furnished, and saw candles and flagons there. At this spectacle he marveled, and going close up to the bed, which was curtained by a hanging of silk embroidered with a network of jewels, drew back the curtain from before the princess, and saw her sleeping with her arms around the neck of a young man handsomer than herself. Whereat he magnified Allah Almighty, who had created such a youth of vile water, and said, How goodly be this fashion for one who hateth men! How comes she by this fellow? Methinks 'twas on his account that she knocked out my back teeth. Then he drew the curtain, and made for the door, but the king's daughter awoke in a fright, and seeing the eunuch, whose name was Kafur, called to him. He made her no answer. So she came down from the bed on the estrade, and catching hold of his skirt, laid it on her head, and kissed his feet, saying, Veil what Allah veileth. Quoth he, May Allah not veil thee, nor him who would veil thee. Thou didst knock out my grinders, and saidst to me, that none make mention to me aught of men and their ways. So saying, he disengaged himself from her grasp, and running out, locked the door on them, and set another eunuch to guard it. Then he went into the king, who said to him, Hast thou given the necklace to Hayat Al-Nufus? The eunuch replied, By Allah, thou deservest altogether a better fate. And the king answered, What hath happened? Tell me quickly. Whereto he answered, I will not tell thee except private and between our eyes. But the king retorted, saying, Tell me at once and in public. Cried the eunuch, Then grant me immunity. So the king threw him the kerchief of immunity, and he said, O king, I went into Princess Hayat Al-Nufus and found her asleep in a carpeted chamber, and on her bosom was a young man. So I locked the door upon the two and came back to thee. When the king heard these words, he started up, and taking a sword in his hand, cried out to the rays of the eunuch, saying, Take thy lads, and go to the princess's chamber, and bring me her and him who is with her, as they twain lie on the bed, but cover them both up. And Shahrazad perceived the dawn of the day, and ceased saying her permitted say. Now, when it was the 735th night, she resumed, It hath reached me, O auspicious king, that when the king commanded the head eunuch to take the lad to fetch and set before him Hayat Al-Nufus, and him who was her, the chief and his men entered the princess's apartment, where he found her standing up, dissolved in railing tears, and the prince by her side. So he said to them, Lie down on the bed as thou wast, and let him do likewise. The king's daughter feared for her lover, and said to him, This is no time for resistance. So they both lay down, and the eunuchs covered them up, and carried the twain into the king's presence. Thereupon Abd al-Qadir pulled off the coverings, and the princess sprang to her feet. He looked at her, and would have smitten her neck, but the prince threw himself on the father's breast, saying, The fault was not hers, but mine only. Kill me before thou killest her. The king made at him to cut him down, but Hayat Al-Nufus cast herself on her father and said, Kill me, not him, for he is the son of a great king, lord of all land in its length and breadth. When the king heard this, he turned to the king Wazir, who was a gathering place of all that is evil, and said to them, What sayest thou of this matter, O minister? Quoth his Wazir, What I say is that all who find themselves in such a case as this have need of lying, and there is nothing for it but to cut off both their heads, after torturing them with all manner of torture. Thereupon the king called his sworder of vengeance, who came with his lads, and said to them, Take this gallows bird, and strike off his head, and after do the like with this harlot, and burn their bodies, and consult me not about them a second time. So the headsman put his hand to her back to take her, but the king cried out at him, and cast at him something what he had in hand, which had well nigh killed him, saying, O dog, how durst thou show ruth to those with whom I am wroth? Put thy hand to her hair, and drag her along by it, so that she may fall on her face. Accordingly he hauled her by her hair, and the prince in like manner, to the place of blood, where he tore off a piece of his skirt, and therewith bound the prince's eyes, putting the princess last, in the hope that someone would intercede for her. Then, having made ready the prince, he swung his sharp sword 3 times, whilst all the troops wept and prayed Allah to send them deliverance by some intercessor, and raised his hand to cut off Ardashir's head, when, behold, there arose a cloud of dust that spread and flew till it veiled view. And the cause thereof was that when the young prince had delayed beyond measure, the king, his sire, had levied a mighty host, and had marched with it in person to get tidings of his son. Such was the case. But as regards King Abd al-Qadir, when he saw this, he said, O wits, what is the meaning of yonder dust that dimmeth sights? The Grand Wazir sprang up and went out to find out, and behind the cloud of men like locusts, of whom no count could be made, nor aught avail of aid, filling the hills and plains and valleys. So he returned with a report to the king, who said to them, Go down and learn for us what may be this host, and the cause of its marching upon our country. Ask also of the commander, and salute him for him, and inquire the reason of his coming. And he came in quest of aught, we will aid him, and if he have a blood feud with one of the kings, we will ride with him, or if he desire a gift, we will hansel him, for this indeed is a numerous host, and a powerful uttermost, and we fear for our land from its mischief. So the minister went forth and walked among the tents and troopers and bodyguards, and ceased not faring on from the first of the day till near sundown, when he came to the warders with gilded swords and tents star-studded. passing these, he made his way through to the emirs and wazirs and nabobs and chamberlains to the pavilion of the sultan, and found him a mighty king. When the king's officers saw him, they cried out to him, saying, "Kiss ground, kiss ground." He did so, and would have risen, but they cried out to him a second and a third time. So he kissed the earth again, and raised his head, and would have stood up, but fell down a full length for excess of awe. When at last he was set between the hands of the king, he said to him, "Allah prolong thy days, and increase thy sovereignty, and exalt thy rank, O thou auspicious king. And furthermore, of a truth, King Abd al-Qadir saluteth thee, and kisseth the earth before thee, and asketh on what weighty business thou art come. And thou seek to avenge thee for blood or any king, he will take horse in thy service. Or an thou come in quest of aught wherein it is his power to help thee, he standeth up at thy service on account thereof." So Ardashir's father replied to the wazir, saying, "O messenger, return to thy lord, and tell him that the most mighty king, Saf al-Azam Shah, lord of Shiraz, had a son, who hath been long absent from him, and news of him have not come, and all traces of him have been cut off. And he be in this city, he will take him and depart from you. But if he aught have befallen him, or any mischief have ensued to him from you, his father will lay waste to your lands, and make spoil of your goods, and slay your men, and seize your women. Return therefore to thy lord in haste, and tell him this ere evil befall him." Answered the minister, "To hear is to obey." And he turned to go away, and the chamberlains cried out to him, saying, "Kiss ground, kiss ground." So he kissed the ground a score of times, and rose not till his life breath was in his nostrils. Then he left the king's high court, and returned to the city, full of anxious thought concerning the affair of this king, and the multitude of his troops, and going in to King Abd al-Qadir, pale with fear, and trembling in his side muscles, acquainted him with what had befallen him. And Shahrazad perceived the dawn of the day, and ceased to say his permitted say. Now, when it was the 736th night, she said, "It hath reached me, O auspicious king, that the wazir returned from the court of the great king, pale with fear, and with side muscles quivering for dread exceeding, and acquainted his lord with what had befallen him. Hereat disquiet and terror for himself, and for his people, laid hold upon him, and he said to the minister, 'O wazir, and who is this king's son?' Replied the other, ''Tis even he whom thou badest put to death, but praised be Allah who hastened not his slaughter. Else had his father wasted our lands and spoiled our goods.' Quoth the king, 'See now thy corrupt judgment, in that thou didst counsel us to slay him. Where is the young man, the son of yonder magnanimous king?' And quoth the wazir, 'O mighty king, thou didst command him to be put to death.' When the king heard this, he was clean distraught, and cried out from his heart's core and inmost of head, saying, 'Woe to you! Fetch me the headsman forthright, lest death fall on him.' So they fetched the swordsman, and said to him, 'O king of the age, I have smitten off his head, even as thou badest me.' Cried Abd al-Qadir, 'O dog, and this be true, I will assuredly send thee after him.' The headsman replied, 'O king, thou didst command me to slay him without consulting thee a second time.' Said the king, 'I was in my wrath. But speak the truth ere thou lose thy life.' And said this order, 'O king, he is yet in the chains of life.' At this Abd al-Qadir rejoiced, and his heart was set at rest. Then he called for Ardashir, and when he came, he stood up to receive him, and kissed his mouth, saying, 'O my son, I ask pardon of Allah Almighty for the wrong I have done thee, and say thou not aught that thou may lower my credit with thy sire, the great king.' The prince asked, 'O king of the age, where is my father?' And the other answered, 'He is come hither on thine account.' Thereupon quoth Ardashir, 'By their worship, I will not stir from before thee till I have cleared my honor and the honor of thy daughter from that which thou layest to her charge, for she is a pure virgin. Send for the midwives, and let them examine her before thee. And they will find her maidenhead gone. I give thee leave to shed my blood. And if they find her a clean maid, her innocence of dishonor and mine also will be made manifest.' So he summoned the midwives, who examined the princess, and found her a pure virgin. and so told the king, seeking largesse of him. He gave them what they sought, putting off his royal robes to bestow on them, and in like manner he was bountiful to all who were in the harem. And they brought forth the scent cups, and perfumed all the lords of estates and grandees, and not one but rejoiced with exceeding joy. Then the king threw his arms around Ardashir's neck, and entreated him with all worship and honor, bidding his chief eunuchs bear him to the bath, and crowned him with a coronet of jewels. He also girt him with a girdle of silk purfled with red gold, and set with pearls and gems, and mounted him on one of his noblest mares, with saddle and trappings of gold inlaid with pearls and jewels. Then he bade his grandees and captains mount on his service and escort him to his father's presence, and charged him to tell his sire that King Abd al-Qadir was at his disposal, hearken him to and obeying him in whatso he should bid or forbid. I will not fail of this, answered Ardashir, and farewelling him, repaired to his father, who, at sight of him, was transported, for delight and joy and gladness spread among all the host of the great king. Then came the wazirs and chamberlains and captains and guards, and kissed the ground before the prince, and rejoiced in his coming. And it was a great day with them, for enjoyment, for the king's son gave leave to those of King Abd al-Qadir's officers, who had accompanied him, and others of the townfolk, to view the ordinance of his father's host, without let or stay, so they might know the multitude of the great king's troops, and the might of his empire. And all who had seen him selling stuffs in the line-draper's bazaar marveled how his soul could have consented thereto, considering the nobility of his spirit and the loftiness of his dignity. But it was his love and inclination to the king's daughter that was what constrained him. Meanwhile, news of the multitude of her lover's troops came to Hayat Al-Nufus, who was still jailed by her sire's commandment, till they knew that he should order respecting her, whether pardon and release or death and burning. But she looked down from the terraced roof of the palace, and turning towards the mountains, saw even these covered with armed men. When she beheld all these warriors, and knew that they were the army of Ardashir's father, she feared lest he should be diverted from her by his sire, and forget her, and depart from her, whereupon her father would slay her. So she called a handmaid that was with her in her apartment by way of service, and said to her, Go to Ardashir, son of the great king, and fear not. When thou comest into his presence, kiss the ground before him, and tell him what thou art, and say to him, My lady saluteth thee, and would have thee to know that she is a prisoner in her father's palace, awaiting his sentence, whether it be minded to pardon her, or to put her to death. And she beseecheth thee not to forget her, or forsake her. For today thou art all-powerful, and whatso thou commandest no man dare cross thee. Wherefore, and it seemed good to thee to rescue her from her sire, and take her with thee, it were of thy bounty, for indeed she endureth all these trials for thy sake. But an this seem not good to thee, for that thy desire of her an end, still speak to thy sire, so happily he may intercede for her with her father, and he depart not, till he had made him set her free, and taken surety from and made covenant with him, that he will not go about to put her to death, no work her aught of harm. This is her last word to thee. May Allah not desolate her of thee, and so the peace. And Shahrazad perceived the dawn of the day, and ceased to say her permitted say. And so do I cease the telling of this tale for today, till it be morrow.